Don't ask me why, but not long ago I sat in on a law school class in civil procedure. And when the class was over and I walked out, I was reminded of the difference between an educational experience that's intellectually engaging and one that's merely academically rigorous. What I've done there, if you're paying attention, is to give you two distinctions there for the price of one. I'm distinguishing between the academic and the intellectual, which is a critical difference that can revolutionize the way we think of schooling. In another episode of this podcast, I quoted the early childhood educator Lillian Katz, who said the problem with early childhood education is that we tend to overestimate kids academically and underestimate them intellectually. But the other distinction, or part of this distinction that I'm drawing, is between that which is rigorous and that which is engaging. And more broadly today, I want to talk about why it is that we overvalue rigor. It's a very simple point, and it's a point that's critical to debates about school reform, and yet it is widely overlooked. The simple fact is, schooling isn't better just because it's harder. I'm Alfie Kohn, and this is Kohn Zone. So you're familiar with the nomenclature for this, right? Talk about dumbing down our schools. For many years, people criticized high schools because we were dumbing down the education. It takes a certain kind of personality to look at high schools where we cram too many kids into classrooms for too short a period of time, where they have no meaningful connection to adults, and they're supposed to just passively lap up facts and spit them back on tests, and it's all about homework and quizzes and grades, and you look at that situation where the education has little meaning or import to most of the kids, and you say that the real problem is it's not hard enough. That's the kind of orientation that also shows up when we talk about higher expectations or the word rigor itself. You know, I'm reminded of a principal I know named George, who was saying hello to kids and their parents during drop-off time early in the school year, and a parent came up to him and said, "Are you going to give my kid a rigorous education in this school?" And George thought a minute and said, "I don't know. Let me look up the word tonight and I'll get back to you with an answer tomorrow." And the next morning he sought out that parent and said, "The answer to your question is, good heavens, no." If you have an old-fashioned print unabridged dictionary, I invite you to look up the word rigorous in it. My American Heritage Dictionary says, see synonyms at harsh. Or how about this expression, which could well win the award for silliest expression over the last 25 years in education? And it was a rough contest this year with many nominees, but my winner would be raising the bar. Remember all the groups of politicians and corporations talking about the demand for accountability-based school reform that said they were going to raise the bar? I'm pretty sure that phrase originated in the world of show horses, which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the view of children on the part of people who talk like this. It's everywhere, this notion that harder is better. Parents have often internalized this. You know, the kind of parent who just complains that their uber-talented child isn't sufficiently challenged by what they're being asked to read. How many parents complain that the stuff simply isn't interesting or meaningful to kids, or that the kids had no role in deciding on what they do all day. But no, the overwhelming criticism is that it's not challenging enough. Or parents who say to the teacher, my child who learned how to read at age 4 is bored because the worksheets are too easy, not even breaking a sweat to answer all the questions correctly. I always imagine a teacher responding to that complaint by saying, how about if we give your child 25 really hard questions instead of 10 that are not so hard? The parent, of course, here should say, are you making fun of me? But sadly would be likely to smile with gratitude. Obviously, the problem is that the teacher is giving worksheets at all, not how hard the questions are on them. Or take the use of advanced placement courses in high school. AP courses are almost always the hardest courses in a high school. Does that mean they're among the best? Widely, it's assumed that that's true, when in fact AP courses are often terrible. They merely accelerate the worst forms of pedagogy. Many of them are lecture-based. All of them, by definition, are oriented not to deepening understanding, but to giving kids the facts they need in order to do well on a test. The whole thing is exam-based. And yet we assume because it's rigorous, it must be a course that we want our children and more children to take. When we talk about the primary grades, the same problem shows up. With taking harder stuff and pushing it downward to the earliest grades, the youngest children. The kindergarten, which means child's garden, has often been turned into a really bad first grade classroom now. Or take the emphasis on what we do with kids who don't deal well with all of this rigor, all of this difficulty. If they fail a test, even in elementary school, we may flunk them and force them to do the class again, retain them in grade. The research overwhelmingly shows how counterproductive that is with regard to kids' long-term academic success, their psychological well-being, and the likelihood of their graduating. In fact, one study a few years ago that followed kids for 14 years found that holding at-risk kids back a year in elementary school is diabolically effective at getting them to drop out of high school. And yet, it's about raising the bar and not letting them go on to the next grade unless they've done well on a test. Homework, the practice of making kids work a second shift when they get home from a full day in school. We offer more of it, it's harder, and above all, the number one trend over the last few years is to give homework to the youngest children in a way that was never done before. Maybe the ultimate example of this sort of macho version of school reform, accountability, is to have very difficult standardized tests, in many cases high stakes, meaning, well, in the case of retention, if you don't pass the test, you have to repeat a grade. Or in high school, if you don't pass the test, in some states, happily fewer than there were 10 years ago, but still some states, if you don't pass a series of tests, you don't get a diploma, regardless of the evidence of 12 years of other academic accomplishments. One commissioner, state commissioner of education, said something on this topic that has stayed with me. I don't want to embarrass him by telling you which state it is. It could be any state that has a mile-high city in it. But he said the following: unless you get bad results, it is highly doubtful you've done anything useful with your tests. Low scores have become synonymous with good tests. That's a direct quote. That's a quote that threatens to make satire obsolete. So thoroughgoing is the commitment to the ideology that harder is what it means to be better in schooling. So, how do we respond to this? Well, the first response is one that a bright 8-year-old could have, that stuff can be too easy, but it can also be too hard. The ideal amount of hard is not the maximum amount of hard. I mean, yeah, if it's too easy, you might not be challenged enough. You might be bored. But stuff that's too hard leaves kids feeling stupid, feeling alienated, feeling uninterested in schooling, and sometimes, because of that, acting out, because it's less threatening to be seen as incorrigible than to view yourself as inadequate. Jerome Bruner, the great educator, said, yeah, some questions are laughably easy and some are impossibly difficult, but the trick is to find the medium questions that can be answered and that take you somewhere. So just because it's harder doesn't mean it's more valuable. I mean, I have visited schools that boast about how rigorous the education they provide is, and my reaction is I wouldn't send my dog to some of these schools. Conversely, I've been lucky enough to watch teachers in classrooms that I think are absolutely splendid, just amazing. I'm thinking, I want to send my kids to this teacher. I wish I had had this teacher. And yet those classrooms, while amazingly engaging, are not necessarily rigorous in the traditional sense. They're not defined by how challenging the material is. Anyway, the first basic, obvious reaction is that harder isn't always better. But I think there's an important second reaction here, which is that it's not just that medium difficulty is better than high difficulty level. It's that we're putting too much emphasis on the whole criterion. It's not just that harder isn't always better. It's that focusing on the difficulty level often doesn't make sense. John Dewey, as is often the case, put it very well 100 years ago. The value of what students do, he said, resides in its connection with a stimulation of greater thoughtfulness, not in the greater strain it imposes. And yet strain is what many adults think kids ought to be suffering from because that shows how valuable the education is, which is sort of like judging an opera on the basis of how many notes it contains that are really hard for the singers to hit. Even long before Dewey, Voltaire, 300, I think, years ago, said, "That which is merely difficult gives no pleasure in the end." So imagine a kid coming home thrilled with what happened in school, bubbling over with stories about this joyful learning that happened today. How does the parent react? A lot of parents are happy that their kids are happy, of course, but they have this little voice in their head thinking, yeah, but is she really learning anything if it was so enjoyable? This is what I call the Listerine theory of education. I named this after that vile-tasting mouthwash. Many years ago, an ad agency that they hired decided to turn that feature of it into a selling point. The slogan was something like, yeah, it tastes terrible, that's how you know it's working. And that's the view of education in many parts of this country. A glorification of grit, a suspicion of anything that is feel good. That's the conservatives' ultimate insult about education in particular, feel good learning. You know, if you're enjoying it, it's not good for you. The idea here is that deprivation and struggle and sacrifice aren't just occasional means you have to adopt to get to a valuable end. They're valuable in their own right. I'm not even going to touch the theological roots of this way of thinking. I'm just going to point out how absurd and counterproductive it is in an educational context. Rigor, raising the bar, all that stuff leads teachers to teach typically the same things in pretty much the same way, except now with fewer students being able to succeed. What we need to do, I would argue, is to look instead at the method of instruction, at the underlying theory of learning, not quibble about how hard the assignment is or how much the students have to strain. It's kind of interesting, speaking of the method of instruction, that certain traditional kinds of pedagogy, especially direct instruction, where you basically just show or tell the kids the right answers and the facts that they'll be tested on, and a traditional curriculum, which is mostly about facts, pairs very well with a rigor fetish, because traditional teaching creates hard work, often unnecessarily. It's more difficult to learn how to read if you have to decode a string of phonemes as opposed to making sense of interesting stories. It's more exhausting to memorize a list of scientific vocabulary words than it is to learn science by doing science, devising your own experiment, for example. If kids are forced to learn facts without context, skills without meaning, well, it certainly is handy to have an ideology that values difficulty for its own sake. So if somebody asks me, don't you want students to be challenged? Don't you want kids to have to live up to higher expectations and go to a school that stands for excellence? My response is, it depends on how you're defining those terms. If you mean a deeper, richer, more engaging curriculum in which students play an active role in integrating ideas and pursuing controversial questions, well then sure, I'm all for challenge. But if you're using those words to justify, memorizing more state capitals or getting students to bring up their grades, which research overwhelmingly shows tends to lead to shallower kinds of learning when they're focused on A's, not on ideas, well, then rigor and challenge per se, I don't think are worth supporting. Oh, and as for those rigorous, high-stakes standardized tests that are driving this whole movement, allow me to quote my friend Debbie Meyer, who came up with what she modestly called Meyer's Mandate, which goes as follows: no student should be expected to meet an academic requirement that a cross-section of successful adults in the community cannot. When I first came across that, I immediately came up with Kohn's corollary to Meyer's Mandate, which is people who talk sanctimoniously about the need for tougher standards and raising the bar should be required to take high school exit exams themselves and have their scores published in the newspaper. I think Debbie Meyer at one point had an alternate version of Meyer's Mandate, which wasn't just about successful adults in the community more generally. It was specifically about other high school teachers. If an English teacher in a high school, a very good one, can't pass the high school math test, or a science teacher can't pass the social studies or history test, that should be our first clue that there's something wrong with the test. So what I'm saying here is that standards and tests in our country at this point with this whole rigor fetish aren't just ridiculously difficult. They're simply ridiculous. You see the difference there? It's not just that they're hard, it's that they don't reflect what we honor, the stuff that we think is important about schooling, about life. So let me give you one example from a test question used in my own state, Massachusetts, the MCAS high school test. It had this question on it. A set contains the numbers 8 halves, that is 8 over 2, negative 2.3, 0, 2 sevenths, the square root of 9, negative 12, and 2 pi. And then the question asks with several multiple choice options, how many of these are irrational numbers? The correct answer to that question is, who cares? It's a hard question. A lot of kids will fail, but there's no higher order thinking involved here. There's no mathematical thinking involved. It's just arbitrary conventional knowledge. It's the same with other pointless nomenclature in math, like memorizing the definition of an improper fraction. It's not even limited to math. In English, kids may be asked, what's the difference between a simile and a metaphor? Same answer. You can ask questions like that are really difficult and that a lot of kids won't get right, and then boast that you've raised the standards in your school or district or state or country. But you haven't created meaningful assessment because you haven't done meaningful learning. And the worst aspect of this is that when these folks talk about higher or tougher standards, they mean standards that all kids won't ever be able to achieve, to meet. A quote Debbie Meyer again. She and I, in a dinner we had years ago, came up with the following thought experiment. Imagine that in your state, this year, almost all the kids in the state who took the standardized test passed, scored above the cut score. What do you suppose the reaction would be from the governor, from the State Board of Education, from the people who write the editorials in your newspaper? Do you think they would say, wow, those teachers must be amazing? When I've offered this thought experiment in lectures to teachers, and I offer that possible response, everybody laughs because, of course, it's absurd. It's completely implausible. Everybody knows the answer to the question. If almost all the kids did okay on the test, they would assume the standards were too low and had to be raised, and the test was too easy and had to be made more difficult. And that's not just a hypothetical thought experiment. That's exactly what a number of states from New Mexico to New Jersey have done. And what does that tell you? Again, it means that when they talk about higher standards, they mean standards that all kids won't be able to reach. Because if they did reach them, we would just ratchet them up again until we made sure there are always losers. And that's at the core of this whole conflation of harder with better. There must always be losers. Excellence, by definition, is something that everybody can't achieve. And that would be disturbing enough if a random sample of students were unable to succeed. But you and I know it's more ominous than that the kids who will be guaranteed to fail, because failure is built into the system, are kids who are disproportionately kids of color, kids whose first language at home isn't English, kids with special needs, kids in vocational programs. So you can't judge a test or a text or a teacher. You can't judge a classroom or a school on the basis of its being rigorous. You got to tell me if it's good and why it's good. If a classroom piques kids' curiosity, if a book, a text, offers a new perspective, if a lesson plan spurs children to make connections and distinctions among ideas, great. But none of those meaningful things are necessarily going to happen just because it's more rigorous. Something that's more difficult may just turn kids off to learning it. It may allow you to sort kids, to figure out those who are able to tough it out so you can give them a doggy biscuit. But it's not enough to be hard. Or as Thoreau said, it's not enough to be busy. The question, he said, is what are we busy about? If kids are being pelted with more forgettable facts than ever before, if they're being drilled on what'll help them ace a standardized test, well, then we may indeed have raised the bar, and more's the pity. In that case, school may be harder, but it sure as hell isn't any better.